Bernard Nomberg, it's good to see you, buddy. How are things in Alabama today?
They're great, Mitch. Thank you. I love your intro, by the way, but thank you for having me on today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Well, I love having you on today. I love having good people talking about interesting topics. Right now in the news, NFL injuries. We're watching marquee players go down every single weekend. And I know you're getting a lot of questions. I'm getting a lot of questions. So today, you guys, we're going to have Bernard, who's a work comp attorney out of Alabama, share some broad brushstroke thoughts about NFL work comp cases. What are we watching and what's happening behind the scenes? I want to encourage everybody out there while I'm introducing Bernard in the next couple of seconds, Bernard, share this out. Ask your questions. We're going to be answering questions live during the show. And whether you're watching live or recorded, hit the share button and let's share Bernard Nomberg of Nomberg Law with the world. So Bernard, let me give you a quick introduction. You are a civil litigation lawyer in Birmingham, Alabama. You have been since 1995. You received your undergraduate degree in history from Vanderbilt University. You also played a little quarterback for the team. I think that's pretty cool and applicable to today's show. And you attended Vanderbilt on a full athletic scholarship. So congratulations. That's a great accomplishment. You graduated in 1994 from law school. And your practice, I believe, primarily focuses on workmen's compensation, Social Security, disability, and personal injury and wrongful death cases. You've served as the chair of the Alabama State Bar Workers' Compensation Section, and you're a member of the Birmingham Bar Workers' Compensation and Solo Small Firm sections. That's why I have you on today's show. Isn't that cool, everybody? Bernard, you're also developing quite a presence on social media, especially TikTok, as a lawyer from Alabama, doing all kinds of fun and crazy things. And that's why I think Lisa and I connected with you. We love your story. We like who you are as a human being. And I want to thank you once again for being on today's show.
Well, Mitch, thank you very much for having me on today. I have appreciated and enjoyed my friendship with Lisa and you for the last several years. And I'm glad to spend some time with you and your audience for the next little bit on this topic.
It's going to be fun. So I think and by the way, I know you're talking about Lisa. You appreciate your relationship with Lisa, your friendship with Lisa. I'm just along for the ride, and I'm okay with that. Let's talk about work comp. Generally speaking, doesn't necessarily have to do with the NFL. What exactly is work comp, and what do people need to know about the work comp system?
Well, Mitch, in general, work comp is a set of laws that are unique to each and every state that help to protect workers, employees who are injured on the job. And again, every state's laws and rules are different. But if you qualify in your particular state as being an employee, and that's a person who's hired for wages, as opposed to somebody who's a volunteer or somebody who may be working on a work release program from prison or jail. If you're an employee and you qualify in that definition within your state and you're injured in the course and scope of your job, generally you're going to be covered for the event that injured you, whether it's trauma, meaning an accident like a car accident or a piece of equipment breaks and it injures you, or cumulative, where, for example, if you're a production worker on a line and you develop carpal tunnel, or a chemical exposure where you work in a place like a lime plant and you inhale the bad chemicals and it causes injury to you. Those injuries should be paid for through workers' comp, whether it's insurance that is contracted with the employer to cover it, or if the company's self-insured. Additionally, there may be compensation due to the injured worker, either during what I call the recovery period, when they're getting healthy and they're off of work, getting healthier and off of work, or at the end of the process when the doctors have released the worker back to some level of returning to work with limitations or with not. There may be permanency to the injuries, and they may qualify for compensation that level.
There's a lot to take into consideration. Yeah. And, I remember years ago, we were thinking about adding workers' comp into our practice, Bernard, and it was so complicated. And I realized it's such a specialty that I was smart enough to stay away from it, to refer these types of cases to people like you that are smart enough to deal with this.
Years ago.
And and look, when it comes to injuries, what I'm watching every weekend is I'm watching an employee that's an employee of an NFL team getting hit over and over and over again. A couple of weeks ago, you had Chris Gronkowski, who's a ex-NFL player, on your live video show. You guys talked a little bit about work comp. I had him on the show last week to talk about being an entrepreneur after his NFL career. But it was fascinating listening to your conversation with Chris and kind of pulling back the curtain to learn more about what it's like once you're injured in the NFL. Are NFL players covered by work comp?
They are, but one thing to keep in mind, well, many things to keep in mind, because every state has its own set of rules, regulations, and laws. Each NFL player, depending on where their franchise location, where they've contracted, whether it's in California, Florida, Georgia, wherever it may be, those particular states' laws likely will be the laws that'll control the matter. It doesn't matter if you run a forklift or if you're a school teacher or if you're a quarterback for the Saints. You're going to be covered in one way or another through the various states' work comp laws.
So if you're playing for the Miami Dolphins and you're in Los Angeles, California, taking on the Rams and hopefully getting spanked by the Rams, my Rams, and you're injured, it sounds to me like that work comp case would normally be handled in the state of Florida, not the state of California.
Well, California and Florida have some unique laws. In fact, in 2013, California, because there were thousands and thousands of NFL work comp claims, somebody, a skillful lawyer, found a loophole that allowed NFL players that weren't stationed, or their home team, if you will, were outside of California, but they played games in California. They were filing all of these claims, literally thousands, and it was costing the state of California and its taxpayers billions of dollars because of the effects of this. Ultimately, California changed its laws to make it much more stringent about who can actually file those claims. But one of my arguments would be, if I'm hurt in the state of Florida, if I'm employed in the state of Florida, but I'm hurt in another state, say California, where I actually get hurt, I'm going to compare those states' laws to see if I can make either a single occurrence claim in Florida, because that's where I'm based, or I can make a claim in California because that's where the event occurred. Say it was a traumatic hit that created a back injury, and that back injury led to surgeries, and then ultimately led to the medical retirement early, we would claim, of that wide receiver in our hypothetical. I would try to make a claim in California if I could, or I would see if I could have concurrent claims where I might be able to get benefits from both states. And it would take a comparison, Mitch, of each state's laws to determine if I could do either or both.
And it sounds like some states have come down with a law saying you can't do that. You have to bring it in a certain state. In other states, it sounds like it might be a factual, circumstantial type of argument for an attorney like you. When we talk about being hurt on the job, we're rotating over to NFL players being hurt in practice, being hurt on the football field, even coaches on the sidelines getting hit by players and being hurt, coaches that are employed by NFL teams. Those are the employees that we're talking about today. And you said something that I think a lot of people probably aren't aware of. And by the way, everyone, I'm getting your questions coming in. We're broadcasting, Bernard, to Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, a couple of different Facebook channels, and my blog, streaming.lawyer. I will try to bring your questions in, everyone, so do ask them, and we'll get Bernard to answer them. But you said something about California, the state of California, being concerned about the amount of money they're paying out to cover these out-of-state football team work comp cases. So these are claims being paid by the state, not necessarily by the NFL teams themselves.
Mitch, it depends on each franchise can either self-insure or they can contract out with insurance companies that typically cover these types of claims, just like it would be in ordinary life, us civilians who aren't in the NFL or in pro leagues and we get hurt while working for our employers. I can give you my examples in history in Alabama. We have many large employers in our state that choose to be self-insured, which means they're going to be footing the bill for all of this, as opposed to maybe they contract with one of the big insurance companies that also could cover this as well. It's when I say it gets passed on to the taxpayers, what happens is, from my understanding, is all of the costs associated with the NFL experience, tickets, vendors, like buying a soda, all of that goes up because the cost to the NFL franchises also goes up when it has hundreds of these claims. So it's not necessarily that me as a season ticket holder. Well, there's another example. Your tickets may go up as well. So all of those costs go up. And there was a study done several years ago that shows that there was a couple of $1 billion of added expense to the state of California just because of how many hundreds of claims that were being filed. But I think they've gotten that under control, so it doesn't keep happening.
It's a lot of sports fans out there don't think of these NFL teams as businesses, as being subject to different work comp rules and regulations, labor code rules and regulations. And that's why I wanted to talk about this a little bit today. What about what's covered under work comp? If you're a NFL player and you've got a temporary injury that requires a little bit of therapy, it's going to keep you out for a couple of weeks and then you're going to be back in. Maybe you've been hit where it's going to take you out off the field for the rest of the season. Maybe it's going to end your career, God forbid. What are some of the different benefits that these players are entitled to? And I do want to say hi to a mutual friend of ours who asked a great question. He's out of your home state, Attorney Mo Lilienthal. Hey, Mitch and Bernard, and this is for those of you listening to the audio version of today's live video on the podcast next week. Mo asked, typically, if you're injured on the job, workers' comp is responsible for your treatment for life. Is that true for an NFL's workers' comp claim? So I guess the questions would be, what's covered and how long does that coverage last during a player's career?
First, I want to say hey to Mo and thanks for the question. I'll try to answer Mo's question with part of my response. Just like the example where we were talking about the school teacher or the forklift operator, an NFL player also has similar type of benefits that should be afforded to him after he's injured on the job. Whether you're on the active roster or if you're on what's now called the practice squad, it used to be called the taxi squad, the benefits should be medical care for the event that caused the accident. And let's just take that example where we have the wide receiver who hurts his back in a tough, vicious play in a game and ultimately needs surgery, needs rehab, needs physical therapy and the like. All of those costs should be paid for either, depending on the situation, either by the insurance company itself or the team itself. And then the team might seek reimbursement to the insurance company. And that's just kind of some of the behind the scenes or in the weeds, if you will, of how that works. Every franchise is a little bit different on how they've contracted for those things. Another thing that they may be entitled to is compensation. And again, it depends on what the contract says. And here's one of the added things with an NFL player. The players are going to be covered under the National Football League Players Association protections, the union. And they have what's called a collective bargaining agreement, a CBA. And that agreement is between the owners and the NFLPA, the representatives for the players themselves. And that contract itself will spell out all of the terms, which I'm very loosely going over. But in a sense, that's the protections that they have when they get hurt on the job. Medical care, as well as potentially compensation. Now, to answer Mo's question from a minute ago, it depends on what the situation is. Let's take our wide receiver who now has a career-ending back injury, major surgery. His doctors, when I say his doctors, let me back up for just a second, Mitch.
I'm glad you're doing that. Please do.
The work comp medical care is guided by or controlled, if you will, by the team or the insurance company if they're going to pay for it. However, the player does have the right for medical second opinions. The player can actually go get their own doctor as well. But if the insurance company or the team is involved in this, they're going to be, I mean, if they're responsible for paying it, they're going to be involved. And a lot of times in our example with our wide receiver, let's say that it is being recommended by one or more of these doctors that he does not need to keep playing this sport anymore and he needs to retire. Well, in that scenario, he's going to be approached by the franchise to reach, hopefully, a medical work comp settlement. And basically what that is, it's going to be some amount of money that's basically going to retire him from the league. His medical care will go up through that time period that's agreed upon, but then going forward, it's going to be his responsibility. And no, ultimately it's not fair because most of these players average less than 4 years to make it into the league. And they're going to be probably in their mid-20s, maybe late 20s for most of these people, most of these guys. And they still have another, hopefully 40, 50, 60 years of life expectancy, but still may need medical care. The last thing I was going to add to this, Mitch, is one of the things that the NFLPA has done such a much better job in the last 20 to 25 years, particularly the last 10 years, is they have created on their website through their education of the players, players in the union, they've educated them. They've created so much more resources to educate these guys so that they don't suffer what the previous decades players when they have no pension, no money, no way to take care of their medical care going forward. I know that was kind of a long-winded rambling, but there's so much here. I just wanted to kind of broad stroke. Hope that answers your question, Mo.
And we could spend days on this live video show going over this topic together, right? Especially when you're dealing with collective bargaining agreements, which is something, Bernard, that I actually was working with another attorney when I first started practicing law, and that's who we represented, employee associations and employee unions. Mm-hmm. And what's catchy about that, or interesting about that, is oftentimes whoever has the best law firm of lawyers to create these collective bargaining agreements. In other words, are they favored towards the owners? Do they favor the players? Now, I know we both know the answer to that question, especially up until maybe the last 5 or 10 years. But they're very owner and team focused. In other words, those were the people that were negotiating these, and so the player's best interest wasn't placed first. And we're seeing CTE, long-term brain injury cases now that are it's finally being talked about. Finally, trying to figure out how can we improve the player safety and provide for them for the remainder of their lives. But that's something that has been negotiated, and so we're talking about players having access, whether it's for temporary injuries or permanent injuries, to medical bills being taken care of, loss of wages being taken care of, different bills that may come up relating to their care and treatment being taken care of. What happens, Bernard, either in the NFL or in the private sector? Most of the cases that you handle are private sector, right? Private employees. What happens when a work comp doctor says one thing and the employee or an employee's private doctor says another? In other words, I'm not better. I'm still limping and I'm still hurting. How can you tell me I'm okay and it's okay for me to go back into the game, or it's okay for me to go back into work? What do you do as a work comp attorney when you're dealing with that?
Well, I'd love to tell you that times have changed for the better, and I think they have. And don't take some of the movies that we've all seen about, taping it up, giving them a shot in the knee during halftime and sending them back. I'm sure that still happens to get them back on the field, because there's so much money at stake for these guys, and they know that their careers are so relatively short period of time to make the maximum amount of money that they can. However, if there is a disagreement between the two sides, between the player's doctor and the team's doctor, it depends on the state, but you have to go through the either board of the work comp judges board or the medical board, whatever it's called in the particular states, and you may end up having to have a hearing on this issue. One of the things that I think the NFLPA does a much better job is helping to protect the players through the union in these situations. If a player suspects that he has still got an ankle that it just won't do what it needs to do, but he wants to get back into the league. Now, he can't play until he's been medically cleared, by those who are involved. And if he's not medically cleared, he's not going to be on the active roster and making money that's not the guaranteed money. So, yeah, these things I'm sure happen all the time behind the scenes. And that may be why you see players on the IR, the injured reserve, for longer periods of time than was initially suspected. Let me give you one quick example. And I don't have to know what's going on behind the scenes with Drew Brees, the New Orleans quarterback, future Hall of Fame and Super Bowl winning quarterback. Drew has got a ton of busted up ribs and took some vicious hits earlier in this season. So he's been out for a couple of weeks. It was initially announced he'd just be out for 1 or 2 games. I think he may be out. This may be his 3rd game he's been out, and I haven't seen where they've put out where he's coming out to be cleared to play anytime soon. So I don't know how they decide how to put the press releases out about this, but there's a whole lot of negotiations and conversations that I'm sure that are emotional behind the scenes between the player, the player's agent, the reps from the NFLPA, as well as the organization itself, because everybody wants the same thing. They want a healthy Drew Brees on the field leading their team. Now, granted, their backup, who's a wide receiver, jack of all trades, Taysom Hill, he's done quite admirably. Sure. But the health of Drew Brees is the main issue here.
What about I've noticed some of the younger players who might receive an injury their first or second year of playing, and for whatever reason the team wants to cut them loose, maybe go with someone else that might be a draft choice option or something. And now that player is going sideways to another team. He's got a work comp or injury treatment schedule or package or portfolio that he's got to deal with the other team who might be thinking about hiring him and paying him. Can we do this? Look at your injury list. That's something that I think is also part of the negotiation process, right? In other words, what do we put on paper? What are we required to disclose? And I guess work comp requires full disclosure of all the above, I'm guessing.
It does. And one of the added things that for professional sports as a whole, whether it's baseball or any of the other professional sports, a team, a franchise can't sign a player until they're eligible. And they're not, and as part of the eligibility is they have to go through a full physical and evaluation by the team. And also as part of that, I'm sure, is an extensive not only exam of the player and diagnostic testing, et cetera, but also an extensive review of all the medical records. And those records will probably go back all the way to high school or junior high. So I'm sure that file follows the player themselves. One of the examples, Mitch, I wanted to give you is there was a player named Al Noga who played for the Vikings in the 80s and 90s. And with maybe the only sport that has almost a 100% injury rate. I can't imagine other sports having more. But all players at one point or another, just the sport is violent. We all know that. But it's getting cleaned up as technology and medical science is going forward. But Al Noga, like most of these other players who butted heads for many years on the line, had all kind of orthopedic injuries, also had concussion injuries, et cetera. Well, he made claims for both, for orthopedic injuries, which were accepted, and he was treated and he was paid out. But he also had concussion injuries that he was claiming back in the day. And this predated, we haven't really gotten to it because it's not work comp, but it's certainly one of the more newsworthy parts of the NFL is the CTE litigation that's been going on for several years now. Well, Al Noga predated all of that. And at the time he made work comp claims for concussions and head injuries, it was put in the ultimate court order that the protocol just wasn't in place to diagnose concussion-related and permanent head injury cases. So it was interesting to note that back in the day, several years back, a couple of decades back, when he was making orthopedic claims, those were accepted. That wasn't the issue. The issue was his head injury claims. And the science just had not caught up with what was needed from the legal standpoint for him to have successful work comp related concussion. And at that time, it wasn't called CTE, but we'll call it head trauma. Work comp claims were not successful as a result. Now, if you get into the CTE, which is still not part of the work comp protocol, it's a whole separate area of the law. They have this massive class action lawsuit that's been going on several years. There's, I think, $1 billion settlement and fund that's put in place. Many people criticize it. Others have found benefit from it. But the thing is, Mitch, at the time, and I think it may still be this way, you can't diagnose CTE unless it's post-mortem. So a lot of the work comp related benefits that might be available to someone who has an orthopedic injury and is still living, those are not available in the CTE realm. If they come up with protocol that diagnoses CTE while they're still living, that may change this answer. But up to now, it's strictly post-mortem.
I saw a study where they evaluated, X number of NFL players that had passed away and donated, their brains, their bodies to science. And it's something like 9 out of 10, 99% of these players had exhibited signs of traumatic brain injury, CTE, and related issues. I've represented players, Bernard, who have suffered injuries, head injuries on the football field. And it's interesting to get up to speed on what's really going on, the forces, the side impacts, which a lot of people don't realize there's a lot. That's where a lot of the problems come. I think 75% of head injuries on the football field come from side impacts. And I wasn't aware of that. So we'll see how this develops. We'll see how this progresses. Have you noticed in work comp, generally speaking, over the years, that as the medicine and the science and the awareness of an injury becomes more well known, work comp will change its rules and its compensation packages to accommodate that? Or is it a slow process that just takes, that you're still in the middle of?
Mitch, I'd love to tell you that my state is progressive and is changing with the science, but we haven't changed the laws. We haven't changed, and this is where I get on my soapbox for like 8 seconds. We haven't changed the laws or the compensation rates since 1987.
Really? Okay.
And 1992, our State Work Comp Act was codified, and it still is in place today. I don't want to bore you with all those details, but if you think the cost of living has changed just a little bit since 1992, so an injury back then is worth, on paper, the same as it's worth today, but it's not. It's worth so much less. But to answer your question, many other states are slowly doing that. And part of that is PTSD, for example. You have to have, in a lot of states like Alabama, you have to have a physical injury, a broken bone, a pulled hamstring, something physical that also goes with the mental, if you have PTSD or the like. Some other states, very few, but some other states, it can be strictly a mental claim. Like you're a firefighter and you've suffered through a traumatic event in part of your job, that could be covered. But by and large, most states are very, very slow because it has to go through the legislation of each state to change those laws to catch up with the science. Hopefully, case law and education by the doctors are pushing those things forward. Hopefully.
It's a slow process, isn't it? And I think the lawyers that are advocates for their clients who push, more information and a new approach to looking at these things are the ones that are doing their community a good service. And that's why I wanted to have you on, because I know that's what you're all about. Talk to us a little bit about the number of years you played in the NFL, or maybe the age of a player, and what type of short or long-term work comp disability benefits he may have. I know there was a distinction that I heard you and Chris talking about. Just share, if you don't mind, just with everyone that's watching live and recorded.
Mitch, it's very interesting. Chris mentioned that going from that third to fourth year is a big deal in the NFL because it qualifies you, it vests you for certain pension rights and other types of rights that if you don't have enough years of service, you may not qualify for some of those things. He also made a big distinction when we were talking about being on that practice squad versus being on the 53-man active roster. Because just like someone who, in my examples about forklift driver or a school teacher, if you're off of work and you're not making your compensation that you had contracted for your company, for your employment, you're going to be subject to the state maximum and minimums of your state of what you're paid during that time period that you cannot work. So let's take that practice roster fullback who gets hurt in a practice that no one ever hears about. You might read about it on a little byline if your paper actually covers it, or if you subscribe. If you're just a true NFL fan and want to read everything about your team, you'd never hear about that. Well, those practice squad players are limited in their compensation, and depending on what your state's rules are, let's just say you're making $7,300 a week as you're being a practice squad member. Let's say you're out in Colorado, and I'm just kind of going off the cuff here, and their state maximum may be $800 a week for that time period of when you're hurt. That practice squad's compensation is going to drop. That player's compensation during that time that they're not able to play or participate in team functions is going to drop from $7,300 a week to $800 a week during that temporary period. Now, most of the time, if you're on that practice squad, as Chris was telling us, there's no reason for the team to keep you. They can just put in somebody else as a practice squad player, because there's probably 30 other fullbacks just, knocking on the door saying, hey, I'm just as good. They try some out, they put them on there. This is where that, as I referred to earlier, a medical settlement comes out. This is where the team might offer you, I don't know the numbers, but let's just say $10,000 for your back injury for you to basically go away, and you're no longer on the team.
Sign a piece of paper and basically either retire, or you're a free agent to do whatever you want, assuming another team's interested in you.
Yep. Now, let's compare real quick with the active squad member, the Dak Prescotts of the world. The Cowboys quarterback had the horrific season ending, and there's so many of those guys this year, season ending and some career-threatening injuries. Well, what does their contract say? They may have guaranteed money that they've already been paid or that's owed. Or let's take, I think in Dak's case, I think his contract is up this year, and he had turned down, if I remember this correctly, negotiations. He was offered a certain big sum, but held out to finish out his contract because he was banking on having a good year and maybe going for that major contract. And it's all funny to say major contract with, professional athletes making so much money compared to the rest of us out there. But for Dak's case, he may too be subject to that $800 a week example, or depending on what his contract says, he may still be getting paid if it's on a guaranteed basis. They're not about to offer him a medical settlement. They have too much money invested in him.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting because you're talking about contracts. Each player signs a contract with an NFL team, and depending on how good that player's agent is, depending on what terms and conditions are part of that contract, kind of dictates maybe some of the work comp decisions that are made. In other words, if you have a guaranteed contract for the next 5 years and work comp's playing hardball and not interested in paying out what you think, or your private doctors think you're entitled to, you might just want to sign that off, push it aside, and you go with the guaranteed payment provisions of your contract. It just kind of depends on all the different underlying factors. Is it the same way in the private sector, Bernard, when you're representing an employee with a big company?
I wish. It doesn't matter who it is in our state. If you're subject to for example, the Alabama state laws, you're subject to those maximum and minimum payments. Now, the time period that I'm referring to is during the recovery period while they're healing. The other part of the equation is at the end of the process, and let's assume, for our example, that the injured worker, the forklift operator, is given a permanent impairment rating by the doctor. Just like our wide receiver in the other example, he may also get a permanent impairment if the doctors feel that there is that situation. Or there may not be. He may make a great recovery. He may be cleared back to NFL duties, just like my forklift operator may also be cleared back to full duties. Nobody wants to sit around and just collect work comp checks, because it's only 2/3 of your average weekly wage in Alabama and in most states. Again, subject to the cap, minimum or maximum.
So, and I have two questions to ask you. I think you said permanent disability. Can you describe, what do you mean by that? And then my second follow-up question is, in the private sector, if I'm out on work comp, can my employer fire me for being on work comp? And I'm wondering if that same question applies to NFL players. Can NFL players be terminated because they're legally utilizing their work comp benefits?
I'll answer the private sector case first. If it's in Alabama, if you do not have a contract, if you're an at-will employee, which 99.9% of us are, you can be fired at the will of the company really for no reason at all.
Okay.
However, we do have an anti-retaliation statute that says the sole reason for your termination is the work comp claim. That's retaliation. But we all know circumstantially they can make up any reason.
Proving that could be tough.
Yeah, if today is green shirt day and I've got on my blue shirt, as silly as it sounds, they can terminate your services regardless of your situation. A smart company has a provision that they apply across the board that says if you're not able to come back to work within a 6-month period, it doesn't matter what or who you are, we can terminate you. And they enforce that across the board. They could fire you at any point in time after that, as long as they're following known company guidelines. Now, going to the NFL, if you go back to the collective bargaining agreement and the union that the NFLPA has, they have more protections. Again, it goes to yes, they can terminate you. Like we were talking about the practice squad player, the fullback, he's going to get that medical settlement. Chris Gronkowski talked about that. That's ultimately what ended his career. He had a second injury when he was playing with, I think it was the Broncos, his last team. I think it was Broncos. Mm-hmm. That ultimately he had a pectoral muscle or an ankle muscle. I can't remember which was which, but that effectively ended his abilities to perform at the high level that's needed for his job. The team offered him a medical settlement that was undisclosed, and it effectively retired him.
It sounds like it's a case by case, factual type of situation, depending on what state you're in, depending on what type of injury you have, depending on everything else you've talked about between collective bargaining agreements, between your original contract that you signed with the team. It's complicated stuff. I'll tell you what, we are going to talk about another topic. I'm looking at questions coming in from Periscope, Twitter. You guys share your questions on LinkedIn, Facebook, on all the different platforms. They are coming in to me. And one of those questions, Bernard, we were going to talk about anyway, and it has to do with college athletes. Talk to us a little bit about, are college athletes protected under workers' compensation law, and or is that something? If not, is that something you see eventually happening at some point in the future? Were you, as a quarterback, Bernard, when you led Vanderbilt to all those undefeated seasons, were you protected under work comp, my friend?
We know there were no undefeated seasons, but yes, I was covered just being, and this is the term we've all heard, student athlete. Where does that term come from? Well, that term comes from about the 1950s, and it really is a term that describes athletes who play in college, but are not at that time considered employees. There's countless cases, and one of the more famous one goes back, what state was it in? Playing, I think it was in Texas, that a player actually died from a head injury while playing in a game in Colorado. The long and the short of it is that the courts in that case ultimately decided that this was really more of an extracurricular activity and not an employment situation. So work comp really did not apply. Now, from my own personal experience, I had some injuries, but they were all covered through our university's medical plan, I guess, that covered all of us. I wasn't paid any compensation, but we did not receive any medical bills because our medical staff that had contracted with our athletics department, they took care of all of that. There is from 2000, let me see what year it was, 2014, there was a group of Northwestern football players who attempted to unionize, not necessarily for the purpose of work comp issues, but it really, I think it was like a precursor to what we now know as the name, image, and likeness laws that was passed in California, and that the NCAA is now trying to wrap their hands around, that will be in effect in about 2 years, 2023. And I think ultimately work comp and other similar issues that we're talking about, protections for those athletes, I think that's going to fall under there. Haven't seen it specifically mentioned, but it just seems like the natural progression of things for them to be able to collectively bargain as a group, like these Northwestern players were attempting to do in 2014. I think that's coming. I really do.
I think it needs to happen because what I'm seeing, at my age, I'm a lot older than you are, Bernard. But what I'm seeing with all my buddies, playing ball in college, they now have residual problems, whether they can't walk, whether they're, in constant pain. And the compensation that the treatment you received when you were playing at Vandy, once you left the school, I'm guessing that treatment was done. I don't think you were still getting physical therapy. You probably still weren't. And so NC2A athletes today, they leave school 5-10 years later, let's just say because of a knee injury, they need knee surgery. Is the school right now, they pick up the tab for that, or
Nope.
Is the athlete on their own? Athletes on their own?
On their own. That's exactly right.
Interesting. So I guess it'd be smart for these athletes to have private insurance if they can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, here's where you may or may not. Also, I'm not an insurance specialist, but we've all heard the term pre-existing conditions.
Right.
So when you fill out your insurance application, if you're asked, you have to be truthful if you have any. And then when you go to the doctor, let's say you have a back injury, and you put what's the nature of it, you're going to put, well, it was in college from 10 years ago. Hopefully the insurance company is going to cover it. You never know.
So focus on getting full and complete coverage if you're an athlete as soon as you can, because frankly, when you're younger, it's less expensive. You'll be covering your pre-existing injuries, which I think will be continue to be the law of the land anyway. So that's eventually, that's one thing. Look what happened while we were on. My daughter just came in with a Starbucks run.
Oh, AJ is MVP. AJ is the MVP.
AJ is definitely making points, and that means I'll be getting up early again to take care of her new little puppy. I'm the early morning shift, which that's why I was up so early this morning. I wouldn't change that for the world. Bernard, this has been awesome, and I want to encourage everybody to reach out to you in Alabama if they have. Let me ask you a question. Mm-hmm. If I'm here in California and I have a work comp case, do I need a California work comp lawyer to represent me, or can I hire someone in Alabama to represent me? How does that work?
It depends on the facts of your case. If it's a California-based company and you're hurt in California and you live in California, it's going to be a California case. So you're going to get one license there. But we all have cases where there are truckers who are injured in one state, live in another state, and their company's based out of a third state. Mm-hmm. That goes back to my example with the Florida and California comparison with NFL. It just depends, because you may be able to have concurrent jurisdiction, which means you can get benefits in both states potentially. So you may need lawyers in both states. I've got cases right now, Mitch, that are based out of Alabama, but South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Utah in 3 of my cases may also apply for benefits there.
I think we're going to see more of that, especially with remote workers right now. In fact, I'm probably going to hop on a live stream later today, Bernard, and talk about some of the differences. And when you have out-of-state remote workers that are actually employees, they're not independent contractors, and they're working for your company here in California, but they're based out of, let's just say, Alabama. And something happens, they're injured. Okay, what are their rights, right? As a work comp case, what are the different tax consequences, state income tax on earnings? What are the employee benefits and labor laws that apply between these multi-states? And the reason I asked you this question, though, was because I think with immigration lawyers, they can represent a client anywhere in the United States. And I wasn't sure if that was the same thing with work comp. So thank you for clarifying that for me. Listen, you guys, wrapping things up, let me just share with you, we're speaking with Bernard Nomberg of Nomberg Law. For those of you listening to the podcast version of this show, that's NOMBERGLAW.com. If you have questions, if you have comments, reach out to Bernard or his experienced team, because they are my go-to work comp experts in the state of Alabama. And also when it comes to just good human beings trying to make the world a better place. This guy right here, there we go. This is one of those people that Lisa and I are proud to call a friend. Bernard, wrapping things up, is there anything we didn't chat about that you want to get out regarding work comp that just completely went over my head, but is super important for the listener?
Mitch, there's one interesting case. Just like in the real world, work comp fraud has become a huge problem in my world, if you will. Work comp fraud is a crime in every state. And that's when somebody is claiming work comp benefits, receives work comp benefits, and then is caught somehow for lying about that, claiming they have a back injury, they can't work anymore as a truck driver, but yet they're seen doing things on Facebook that they post social media wise. They can be prosecuted. There is a now very notable case, a player named Brad Culpepper, All-America player out of University of Florida back in the late 80s, early 90s, went on to play in the NFL for many years, is now coincidentally a personal injury lawyer in Florida. But he retired with an 89% disability injury to his body when he retired from the NFL and was paid, I think, $175,000 as a medical settlement, effectively ending his career. Among other things, he had a horrible bicep tendon tear that disfigured his body, no longer allowed him to be the muscular defensive lineman that he was, that allowed him to play in the NFL. Well, several years ago, he and his wife appeared on one of the Survivor television programs. And if you guys have seen Survivor, it's a show that's been on for years now, competitions. Well, he and his wife appeared on there, Mitch, and it's video of showing Culpepper diving under the water, doing all these physical things that he claimed he couldn't do as a football player. Long story short, the insurance company sued him for insurance fraud. And he's been fighting that for 4 or 5 years now. I don't have any current information as to what it's about. I mean, the status of the case, but he's defended himself on 60 Minutes and other programs. But my point in here being is, much like in the real world where this happens quite a bit, we have to educate our clients about, don't put things on social media that take you outside of your credibility. That you say you can't do these things, but then you put pictures that show otherwise or a video. This happened in the real world in the NFL to a well-known player, and it can happen to anybody.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Bernard, because, you know, whether it's any type of fraud when it comes to what we do, personal injury, wrongful death cases, when it comes to work comp, zero tolerance. That's not good for anybody, right? And it's interesting, though, because we've represented clients who have been severely injured in an auto case, for example, who have been videotaped water skiing, you know, after 3 years later. And, you know, is he really that injured? And when you're representing a world-class athlete who had surgery on their left knee, yes, they can't play soccer anymore, but are they able to go out and water ski with most of their weight on the right, with most of their pulling with their right arm because they grew up water skiing? It's a factual argument that we were able to win. It didn't become a factor in our case, but it's an argument I wish never came up. So I love the warning that you're sharing, is just be smart about what we're putting out on social media.
That's one of the things his wife said when she was interviewed. I wished he'd have never gone on that show.
Sounds like a great idea. Let's go on a television show and abuse our bodies. Yeah, you know, hindsight's 20/20, right? And that's why I wanted to dive in and talk about some of the things that we talked about today to help clarify what's going on right now in the NFL, because you and I are sports nuts, and it's just crazy to watch what's happening this season. Players going down left and right. Christian McCaffrey, one of my favorite players, it's just been a no-show all season and has completely flipped our fantasy football leagues upside down. And so for those of you that have work comp questions, if you want to know what your next correct step is and you're in the state of Alabama, reach out to Bernard. I'll include all of your contact information in our show notes, Bernard. And I'm guessing that if people are out of state, California, Texas, New York, wherever it might be, and they need the name and number of a good work comp attorney, I'm sure if they reached out to you, you'd be able to get them going in the right direction, right?
Absolutely. My brother David, who's my business partner, and I belong to a national organization of work comp lawyers nationwide. And if we don't know somebody personally in your state, we certainly can help you find somebody.
Perfect. Bernard Nomberg, thank you for being on Human.Social. My name's Mitch Jackson, everyone. You guys have a great Monday. Hang in there. Try to enjoy the journey and try to make each day your masterpiece. Bye-bye, everybody.